Welcome to Plain Civics. Thank you for joining us. I'm Joe Ulery.
And I'm Bobbi Fisher.
Our goal is to break down how government works so you can make the government work for you. We are to episode 23. But before we do that, we're going to do the Fast Five.
The Fast Five.
Number 1, comedy, drama, suspense, or documentary.
That's a hard one because I has to be in the right mood for suspense, but I thought comedy, drama, chick flick.
Yep. Sex in the City.
Right. And documentary, it depends. I sit and watch some of those.
Yeah.
But now I like to read suspense books, but I'm not so much on the movies.
Number 2, concert or museum?
Well, this was hard too because depends on who it is. I'd love to go to the concert. Here was my thinking though. Concerts are expensive.
They are.
So I'd probably choose museum right now because I'm poor.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. So video game or board games?
Board games. I'm not much into the video.
Trivial Pursuit.
Yeah. I have a Jeopardy, a box game, Jeopardy. Nobody ever wants to play Trivial Pursuit with me because I always win. But we should get together. And
Since it's close to the holidays, I thought I would ask, best Christmas ever?
I guess what stuck in my mind is I was probably maybe 6 and I wanted the Chatty Cathy doll so bad. And I don't know.
Is that the one where you pull the string?
Yeah, I was going to say, if you're not old enough to know, she was cute and she had I ended up with her and they came out with a sister and I don't remember its name. And then there was a little baby brother, but you pulled the string on the back of their neck and they talked.
Yeah.
Now, I still have my Chatty Cathy. It's in a box. However, it was up in the attic of my mom and dad's garage for so long that when you pull the string now, it sounds like an alien.
She needs to see a
But
doctor.
I still have it.
I love that.
I still have my Barbies too, and I have some of the original,
You've got
from
some
the early 60s.
vintage toys.
I do.
That are probably worth some dough, but probably worth more to you than.
But I think I got Barbies later, so that was probably closer to 10 or 11. But
all right, and then this one, I just thought I'd throw a weird one at you today.
it is weird.
Would you want to know when and how you'll die if that's something that you could get?
And I thought about this a minute, and I thought, no, I don't think I would want to know.
I think we'd live our lives differently.
Right. I think that would be scary.
Yeah, because it's all we would think about.
Right, right.
And we'd start, I think we'd alter our behavior.
Right.
So fun. All right, those were weird but fun. Can you tell we've asked each other about everything there is to ask. So the Fast Five series may be coming to an end.
I was going to say maybe we should mention that after the next one we're going to find something else fun to do.
We are. All right, so that brings us to today's topic, episode 23. Bobbi, let's get to work.
And now our feature presentation.
USA, USA, we're for you today. The cheerleading episode you didn't know you needed.
Yeah, I'm sure as we get into this, you'll know you needed it.
Let's start first with a couple of housekeeping issues. I had planned to naturally follow up our episodes 21 and 22, which were about the different parts of freedom of expression in the First Amendment. And I was going to naturally follow that up with the first part of the First Amendment, freedom of religion. But we're going to move that to episode 24. So it'll be our next episode.
Okay.
We're making this change because one of the reasons...
We needed it.
Yeah, one of the reasons is in order to cover all those freedoms in the First Amendment, I included quite a few Supreme Court cases, and I realize that can make the episodes get kind of tedious.
Yeah.
But I feel that those cases had to be included.
Absolutely.
To help understand kind of where we were, why they came about, and why we're where we are now as far as our rights. And then finally, I thought, although we try to maintain a nonpartisan, non-political podcast, this one may overstep in some of your minds that boundary just a little bit, but I feel the overstep is necessary because it's based in reality and facts.
And I've read through this episode, front page to back page, and I didn't have that concern. Now, one thing I mentioned to you, the way people perceive, we can't control how people filter and perceive us. And although we are stating facts and reality, there are going to be some people that hear it and disagree
natural bias,
and want to fuss with it. But we paid extra special attention to that so that we feel we're not crossing the line. You may feel differently, but here we are.
Right. And I proofread these and I edited, and I went back over it several times, and I know you did, but I don't believe that anything that I'm going to talk about isn't factual. So if anyone does get upset listening to this, our apologies. But we hope that doing this episode will give listeners a break from the tedium of the court cases, because I still have one to go.
Can't wait till we talk about religion.
Right. And it gives us a chance to show that our nation has been in dismal times before, either because of war, economics, or societal changes, or a combination of all of those. And we've made it through those tough times before, and often we come out stronger. So if our listeners are feeling the same despair about the direction of our nation as we've been feeling lately, we hope this episode inspires you and makes you feel more powerful. So if that despair is creeping in, hopefully listening to this episode will help. A couple of weeks ago, I heard political commentator Bill Maher say, this is his quote,
okay.
"What good is making America great again if you end up losing the America part?" End of quote. And it made me stop what I was doing right then, because usually if I'm watching TV, I'm doing other things as well, playing a game or reading or something. But I stopped, and I had to rewind that, and I had my phone in my hand, so I rewound until I got his quote down exactly the way he said it, because it hit me hard. I thought that's a great point, and I don't care which side of the aisle you're on.
Right.
You surely have to see that things in our nation right now are not going well in quite a few ways. Some find much of what's going on in our government completely off the rails. Others may see it differently and may even see me as being hyperbolic here.
You're one of the last people I would ever describe as being hyperbolic, but
Thank
anyway.
you. But the thing is, no matter where you stand, you surely have to agree that we have entered into a dark time as a nation. Many norms have been pushed to the wayside, and for many of us, the current climate of political partisanship and nastiness is jarring. And we talked about a couple episodes ago about political polarization and civil discourse, and we're not as divided as it seems at times. There's nastiness out there.
A lot of nastiness.
Yeah, our political polarization and civil discourse may be worse than any time in our history. But again, none of this is new. Our nation's been in similar situations several times before in our almost 250-year history. We've come through these times of darkness before, and Lincoln's better angels have found a way to prevail.
Yeah.
But they cannot prevail on their own, as we all play a part in overcoming these dark times.
I think that's a good thing to remember, too, is this is not a spectator sport. Democracy is not.
Right.
You can sit all day long on your couch and be upset about what's going on outside your window or across the state or country. But if you continue to choose to do nothing, that's just that much less resistance for something to continue.
Right. In order to create this episode, I didn't just pull all this stuff out of my brain. I can't remember this much stuff, but I did rely heavily on some contemporary historians. One of them, John Meacham, who had a book that he had published in 2018 called The Soul of America, The Battle for Our Better Angels. And another book I got just within the last year, Democracy Awakening, Notes on the State of America by historian Heather Cox Richardson, who also has a daily podcast or YouTube thing on Notes from an American. So
I get an email from her, I think, every day, if not two.
And she's on Facebook. They're like usually 10, 15 minutes long. But she has a couple books. She's a professor as well. And then one I don't have in my notes here, but I think at the end of our episode today, instead of doing the honor roll, I'm going to read a little short essay from another historian whose name is David McCullough, who died, I think, last year. It's just a little short essay from his book that was just published called History Matters. So I was reminded many times throughout our history where we were vulnerable to fear, bitterness, and strife, but we made it through. Meacham points out that in the best of times, the people's witness, protest, and resistance can combine with the leadership of an American president to lift us out of the dark times. If, however, a particular president fails to advance the national story, or worse, moves us backward, then those who witness, protest, and resist must stand fast and work for a better day. Our progress has often been painfully slow, sometimes bloody, and often tragic. Throughout our nation's history, women, African Americans, immigrants, and others have been denied the full promise of the Declaration of Independence. Meacham also points out that there is a, quote, natural tendency in American political life to think that things were always better in the past. Yeah. Nostalgia is a powerful force, end of quote. All has seemed lost before, but the battle between the impulses of good and evil in the American soul, what Lincoln called the better angels of our nature, have prevailed just often enough to put us back on track. In 1944, a Swedish economist whose name was Gunnar Myrdal wrote about what he referred to as, quote, the American creed, devotion to principles of liberty, of self-government, and of equal opportunity for all, regardless of race, gender, religion, or nation of origin. End of quote. Historian Arthur Schlesinger echoed that when he wrote, quote, the genius of America lies in its capacity to forge a single nation from peoples of remarkably diverse racial, religious, and ethnic origins. The American creed envisages a nation composed of individuals making their own choices and accountable to themselves, not a nation based on inviolable ethnic communities, which means set apart from each other. It is what all Americans should learn because it is what binds all Americans together. End of his quote. Meacham says there is a big difference between professing adherence to a set of beliefs and acting upon them. There is a war between the ideal and the real, between what is right and what is convenient, between the larger good and personal interest, and these are at conflict in the soul of every American. In other words, what we as individuals decide to do or how we decide to act or express ourselves comes from our soul. Meacham says, quote, philosophically speaking, the soul is the vital center, the core, the heart, the essence of life. Heroes and martyrs have such a vital center, so do killers and haters. Socrates believed the soul was nothing less than the animating force of reality, end of quote. He, meaning Meacham, posed the question, what is the American soul? He claims that it is the belief that Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal, and it is up to us, from generation to generation, to ensure that we create a place where we can live freely and pursue happiness to the best of our abilities. We can't guarantee equal outcomes, but we can guarantee equal opportunities. Former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt wrote, quote, it is essential that we remind ourselves frequently of our past history, and that we recall the shining promise that it offered to all men everywhere who would be free, the promise that it is still our destiny to fulfill, end of quote. According to Meacham, quote, America has been defined by a sense of exceptionalism, an understanding that destiny has always been tempered by an appreciation of the tragic nature of life, end quote. Theologian Reinhold Niebuhr wrote in 1944, quote, man's capacity for justice makes democracy possible, but man's inclination for injustice makes democracy necessary. That hit me hard as well. We try, and that was the end of his quote, by the way. We try, we fail, but we have to keep trying again because that's the only way progress is possible. We cannot give up. I think one of the most important points that Meacham makes is this. To know what has come before is to be armed against despair. If the men and women of the past, with all their flaws and limitations and ambitions and appetites, could press on through ignorance and superstition, racism and sexism, selfishness and greed to create a freer, stronger nation, then perhaps we too can right wrongs and take another step toward that most enchanting and elusive destination of a more perfect union. And that was his quote. To do so will certainly require many acts of citizenship, bravery, and private goodwill of citizens. Many of us who hold no office or traditional power, but who yearn for a better, fairer way of life for all Americans. It will also require a president of the United States who speaks and works for the country's hopes rather than its fear or his or her personal gains, and one who isn't trying to take us back to a gilded age where few enjoyed the wealth and the masses suffered. As Professor Richardson says, quote, democracies die more often through the ballot box than at gunpoint.
Just real quick here, I can't remember a time where a president blatantly said that he represents the red states and blatantly punishes the blue states.
Right.
Do you recall a time like that?
In my 68 years, that's unprecedented. And just from what I've studied from history, no. The president's supposed to be for all.
Yeah.
Whether you voted for them
red or blue.
or not.
Yes.
Right.
And I think back to when the Space Shuttle Challenger crashed. And I think back to 9/11. And I remember President Bush standing at Ground Zero with the bullhorn. And he was speaking for all of us.
Exactly.
He said, we heard from you, but soon you're going to hear from all of us. And it was that's what I look up at as a president to do, is to be the voice for all of us. And right now, the president's telling us he's not.
Right. I agree totally. And it's, I've been around for 68 years, and I can remember all the way back to President Kennedy's assassination. I was 6 years old. But I remember, and, we had to come together. And that's, President Johnson took the oath of office before they ever left Dallas, and it was a time of coming together. And
yeah, when Reagan was shot, he went.
Right.
There's a story about when he goes in to have his surgery, and he looks up at the doctor, and he said, "I hope." I'm paraphrasing, but he said something like, "I hope you voted Republican." And the surgeon replies, "Mr. President, today we're all Republicans."
Right.
And that's the
the way
feeling
it
I
should
want
be.
from our president.
Exactly. Let's talk about the American character. In an essay I read today titled, Who We Choose to Be, a reflection on the character of veterans, a shared culture of service by Lieutenant General Mark Hertling, who's retired, he says, after some act of political violence or botched policy decision, we usually hear, this isn't who we are, or this is exactly who we are and who we've always been. Hertling says, quote, both sentiments capture something real and both miss the fuller picture. What we see in our worst moments is not who we have always been, but it is what happens when we forget who we aspire to be. Our character, our identity is not inherited. Like our democracy, it must be renewed. The story of America has never been one of perfection. It has been one of persistence, self-correction, and conscience. Who we are is not fixed, but who we become is a choice. And that's the end of his quote there. Our greatest leaders have looked toward the future, not at certain groups. When our country has been divided in the past, such as the time of Lincoln's election and presidency, when our nation was divided and fought a civil war, and again in 1948 when Harry Truman won a four-way presidential race where divisions existed over segregation in our nation, Thomas Dewey, one of the four candidates, said, quote, you can't divide the country up into sections and have one rule for one section and one rule for another, and you can't encourage people's prejudices. You have to appeal to people's best instincts, not their worst ones. You may win an election or so by doing the other, but it does a lot of harm to the country, end of quote. And I underlined and bolded that
yes.
You have to appeal to people's best instincts, not their worst ones. And kind of going back to what you were saying earlier with President Trump, I think the negativity whenever you hear him speak, he's name-calling, he's pointing out groups of people.
At the end of the day, it turns us on each other.
It does.
And it almost is like it makes it okay to tear down
and
other
I think
people.
that goes into our polarization and discourse.
Yeah.
if the president's saying that kind of stuff,
Then it must be okay.
yeah, let's just continue it.
Yeah.
I think it just rubs off. Many of our great leaders, Truman among them, both Roosevelts, Lincoln, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Reagan, and others, understood that the president of the United States has not only administrative and legal powers, but also cultural and moral power. John F. Kennedy said, quote, "For only the president represents the national interest, and upon him alone converge all the needs and aspirations of all parts of the country, all departments of the government, all nations of the world," end quote. Not all presidents have risen to the occasion, but the president sets the tone for the nation. And I think that's exactly what we were the point we're trying to make. Presidential action and presidential grace are often crucial in relieving moments of despair and violence, and presidential indifference and lack of sensitivity can make these moments in our country worse. The country has come to look to the president for a steadying hand in trying times. We are more likely to choose the right path when we are encouraged to do so from the leader. And I think that, again, sums up what you were talking about earlier,
I do
and
too.
the whole point here.
The tone is set at the top.
Exactly. Woodrow Wilson made this observation about the presidency in the early 20th century, as did President John Adams clear back in 1790 when he said, quote, "The people ought to consider the president's office as the indispensable guardian of their rights. The people cannot be too careful in their choice of their presidents," end quote.
That's how important a presidential role is. And remember, the office isn't about a single person. There should be some continuity to how it works.
Like I said a minute ago, the president represents all of us,
All
or
of
should.
us. Yeah.
And not just the people, but the cabinet departments, the government as a whole. And they're what other nations in the world look at.
Yes.
They look at the leader. But sadly, not all presidents have had the personal or moral characteristics to be successful at bringing our nation together in tough times. This is when we must remember that the power of the people is bigger than the people in power. What I have found in studying our history is that there seems to be a couple of themes that usually lead us into these seemingly dark and difficult times. One of those themes is that wealth becomes concentrated in a small group of people, and the other is that certain rights start to become eroded, and in some cases even taken away or attempted to be taken away. Part of this process also usually includes weaponizing language and promoting false history, which can lead to authoritarianism. When these things happen, it is up to the people, many of whom have become marginalized, to reclaim the principles on which our nation was founded. Remember our earlier episodes about the founding and some aspects that went into our founding documents. The founders believed that citizens must be virtuous. In other words, we must be good people with good morals, that we are born with certain unalienable rights, or what they also called natural rights. We are all created equal, and we have a right to consent to our government. We've always been a nation of contradictions, though. These contradictions were generally taken in stride because of whatever the societal norms of the time were. For example, the men who approved the Declaration of Independence in 1776, and just a few years later, the Constitution in 1787 and the Bill of Rights just a couple years later in 1791, they were all well-educated, wealthy professionals, many being lawyers, merchants, large landowners. Several of them had slaves. They had significant experience, for the most part, in military and or politics. And again, many were slave owners. They also held diverse religious views. Some were devout Christians, but the most prominent of them were deists.
Look at a picture of our founding fathers.
Right.
Look at any picture. What do they have in common?
And what he's talking about is, of course, all of them were white men.
Yeah.
White men were not the only people living in America. It is estimated that there were about 10 million Native Americans in North America when the first English colonies were started. By 1776, there were about 450,000 people of African descent in the 13 colonies. Or if you want to think of percents, that's about a fifth, 20% of the entire population of the 13 colonies.
In that short time.
Right. And that's when we declared independence we're talking about. So when Thomas Jefferson wrote the words, quote, all men are created equal, end quote, what did he mean? In 1776, he meant free white male landowners, not women, not African Americans, not Native Americans. But that was an acceptable way to think in 1776 America. Few spoke out about such inequality at the time. The one exception was possibly Abigail Adams, who was the wife of John Adams, who ends up becoming Washington's vice president, and of course he's later elected the second president. But she wrote to her husband while he was away at the meeting of the Continental Congress in 1776, where they're coming up with this declaration and deciding that we're going to fight the British. And she writes to John, quote, I long to hear that you have declared an independency, and by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors.
Wow. She said that so beautifully.
Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. End of quote.
I'm so proud of her.
So Abigail was a women's libber before it was popular.
She was the OG.
Right. But she expressed something here that women would have to work hard on in order to make a reality.
Yeah. And it took a long
time. 143 years after Abigail's letter to John to accomplish what she's talking about in her little letter there.
And it would take another 100 years or so before women could even own property or have a bank account.
Right. And it takes until 1870, which is another 94 years, and a civil war for men who weren't white to gain the right to vote. Because after the Civil War, the 15th Amendment does open the right to vote up to all men.
And we'll get to this, but even then, there were barriers.
Right. So it was a long, sometimes discouraging fight, but we, the people, persevered and fought so that all citizens today have the right to vote. Whenever our nation has been in times of economic and social stress, such as we are today, extremism, racism, nativism, and isolationism are driven by the fear of the unknown and tend to increase sharply, which I want to stop there for just a second. Points out another reason why people need to be more educated and more informed about what's going on, because then they're not as likely to use the fear to cause them to follow along with some of these isms.
Right. And when you have knowledge and you hear somebody spouting off saying something repeatedly that's not true, then you say, hey, no, that's not true. Just like people are saying all the time right now. We're talking about folks that are here from different countries, and they may be undocumented, right? But undocumented people aren't standing in line for government services.
Right. They're the ones working.
Because they're undocumented. And they don't have the documents they need to get those services.
Exactly.
And that's something that is repeatedly told to people, and people don't question it.
Right. And I think anybody, that's listens to our presidents, saying how awful these people are and they're taking the worst of the worst in bigger cities, people see their neighbors who are hard workers.
Right,
and maybe
so
they aren't
are the
here.
worst of the worst the gardeners and the teachers and the roofers and the
moms.
landscapers? Yeah, the moms, the dads, your next door neighbor. Are those the worst of the worst?
Right. If you're not educated or not aware of what's going on, you have a tendency to fall into those traps or believing what you're hearing.
And this is a good point, too, to say to watch more than one news source.
Right.
Read more than one news source, because when you're only getting it from one spot, I hate to say this, but a lot of news sources out there, I'm putting news in quotes, air quotes, diversify where you're getting your information.
Right.
Yeah. And I feel like between a handful of different sources, hopefully one of those you're going to get the truth.
And I think back to, I think it was our episode 6 on sorting out the news. There are also a lot of websites out there that fact check.
Fact checkers,
and they're using facts. Truly facts and data to check. If something sounds kind of funky to you and you're like, what? there are ways you can get to the truth.
And if you're watching something that never makes you question whether it's true and you agree with everything they're saying, you might be spending too much time. Even I have a go-to station, but I spot check.
Right.
I go around. What are other people talk about? What are other people saying about this? And yeah, Google it and run it through the fact checkers and find out for yourself. That's how we fight these changes.
Exactly. Meacham points out that, quote, much of the vibrancy of the American story lies in the courage of the powerless to make the powerful take notice, end of quote. Think here of the long struggle of women's suffrage, and suffrage means gaining the right to vote. It's not suffering, it's suffrage.
Suffrage, yeah.
Or the civil rights fought for by African Americans after the Civil War. They didn't just get that right off the bat. It took years. It took years of segregation, harassment, Jim Crow laws, overcoming the separate but equal doctrine, and that had to be done in the Supreme Court. Violence and, all of those things went into their struggle over the course of about 100 years, but they finally were able to get laws passed to protect themselves from these evil practices and move closer to equality. Notice I didn't say reach equality.
No, because they have, and there's still racism today.
Exactly, because there are still places in America where people of color or other ethnicities are not always free to live or work where they want. They may not face the same issues they did 75 or 100 years ago, like lynchings or sitting in a separate area from whites, but sometimes people still find ways to skirt the laws and treat certain people differently if they aren't like them. Also, Congress has allowed portions of the Civil Rights Acts to expire without renewing them, and that's allowed some states to impose restrictions that sometimes make voting more difficult. And we've talked about this before, but for example, today some voting roadblocks may not be based on the color of your skin, but based on economics. Like maybe you don't have a car and you can't get to the polls, or you can't get to the license branch in Indiana to get a proper voter ID. So, there's still work to be done.
Yeah, and those may seem to some listeners of this podcast far-fetched, but they're not.
No.
Not everybody has a car. Not everybody has two cars in their garage. Some people have to use public transportation. Some people, have kids that they've got to take care of. If you feel like it's harder for you to vote, that should make you stop and think, why?
Well,
why don't they want me to vote?
Too, I don't have this written down, but that made me think, what if people that they have a health problem, or they're totally disabled, and we have the president and certain states railing against mail-in ballots.
Right. Or early
which
voting.
have been proven time and again to not be corrupt, but that person does, actually physically can't get out of their house and go. How are they going to vote if they can't do a mail-in ballot?
And I hope we keep the momentum going, whether you're on the red side or the blue side. We did just have an election, and it seemed pretty decisive, and it seemed like a safe election. And some of those election spreads were pretty far. So I think that folks that sat back and took elections for granted and just thought, somebody else will, this is America, things are great. I think maybe some of those people came out and voted this time around because they finally had to learn the hard way that it doesn't always go the right way that you think it should. New York mayor race, I think I read more people came out to vote in that election. The most people came out since 1969, I think.
It was broke records.
It was incredible. So your vote does absolutely count, and it counts for people that aren't being treated equally or getting the fair road.
And remember, the other thing you always hear, if you don't go out to vote, or you don't cast your vote, you've got nothing to complain about because you didn't play a part in it anyway.
Yeah, and even sometimes when you do vote, you have plenty of things
to vote. You don't always get your way, but that's the way it works.
Yeah, it is.
Fear plays a large part in our lives, whether it is in our personal lives, social lives, or politically and economically. Fear fuels anxiety and anger. The opposite of fear, though, is hope, and hope breeds optimism and a sense of well-being. Fear divides, hope unifies, according to Meacham. He also points out that the measure of our political and cultural health cannot be whether we all agree on all things at all times, We don't, and we won't.
Never.
Disagreement and debate, including ferocious disagreement and exhausting debate, are hallmarks of American politics. And that was the end of his quote. Think back to our episodes on the Constitutional Convention and the long debates the framers had. Jefferson pointed out that differences of opinion have defined free societies since ancient Greece and Rome. Meacham says, quote, "The art of politics lies in the manufacturing of a workable consensus for a given time, not unanimity. This is an art, not a science. Our leaders and representatives in government right now should consider this." Thinking again back to the Constitutional Convention, we reported on the lengthy discussions the framers had about presidential power. If you missed it, that was episodes 7 through 10. And we also had some links on our Facebook page where you could actually look at the long list of debates and how long it took them to debate some of these things, like especially like the executive branch and so forth. But here's a short recap of the debates about just executive power that were held during that convention in the summer of 1787. During the ratification debates, the Anti-Federalists charged that the president would become an elected monarch, that cabals, which means small groups of plotters, would develop to ensure his reelection, and that the presidential veto power would be abused. They further feared that presidential power to grant pardons would allow the president to conspire with others in treasonable activities with impunity. And that means without any punishment or consequences. The Federalists praised the proposed presidency, and they pointed to the weaknesses of the Confederation government and state governments with their nearly powerless executives. And just as kind of a reminder, remember we were under the Articles of Confederation,
Right.
and there was no executive. There was no leader. It was just a Congress, and that was it. So for the Federalists, America needed a separate president with executive powers to enforce federal laws and conduct foreign policy effectively. Federalists contrasted the American presidency with the British monarchy, that was their natural example to go on.
Sure.
Since most of them came, or their ancestors came from England. They argued that the former, that is the presidency, the American presidency, had limited power checked by the other two branches of government, whereas the latter, the British monarchy, had almost unlimited power. Federalists maintained that the president would be accountable to both the people and Congress. If he failed to satisfy the people, he would not be reelected. If he committed crimes, he could be impeached by Congress. In the years since these debates, we have seen most presidents conduct themselves within the views of the Federalists, and when they haven't, they have been held accountable by Congress and/or the federal courts checking their power, just as what the Federalists said should happen. Unfortunately, as we think about the arguments of the Anti-Federalists, it would seem that the current president and his administration has increasingly ignored laws and customs and, at times, has acted as an elected monarch. Cabals, or small groups of wealthy donors, ensured his reelection, and he has used presidential power to grant pardons that many experts are claiming the president has, will, or could use to conspire with others in treasonable activities with impunity. Again, that means without punishment or consequence. We have truly never seen a systematic dismantling of our democracy and our institutions quite like there has been in the first year of this current administration. Unfortunately, we don't know what is going on behind the scenes that may further tear away at our institutions, especially free and fair elections that allow us to have a representative government. The current Justice Department is also acting in ways never seen before, and are seemingly being directed by this president at times, which is not the way it should be. This has caused abuse of due process at the very least. We have had a few presidents who have overstepped their constitutional power before, or have done things that were unprecedented. And just a few examples: Andrew Jackson's Indian removal, which was highly controversial and thought to be against the law back in the 1830s. Lincoln suspending of habeas corpus at the start of the Civil War, which at the time people were up in arms about, but later the court agreed that he was right to do that, even though he kind of went about it a backwards way. And we talked about that. After Lincoln, the president that took his place, Andrew Johnson, he was impeached for violating the Tenure of Office Act, although he was not removed from office, but he did have to go through an impeachment situation. Franklin Roosevelt even ordering Japanese internment camps, which we know today was he shouldn't have done.
Yeah.
Nixon with Watergate and his enemies list. There are actually many more examples, but in all of the previous cases and the ones I didn't name, the checks and balances that are built into our system worked, or people just weren't reelected.
But
in the case of Johnson.
About it, as I look back, and Bobby, correct me, yeah, we've impeached presidents, and a lot of people hear impeached and think, oh, they got kicked out of office.
Right. That's not
but
what it
have
means.
we ever impeached a president and removed him from office? We came close, but Nixon resigned.
Right. That one would have probably, based on historians and people who were there, that would have probably been the first and only case where the president would have been removed. And a lot of people don't understand the impeachment process.
Yeah.
And just, as we said, we've got Andrew Johnson went through impeachment. Bill Clinton was impeached.
Yep.
Trump was impeached twice. That just means that the charges were brought against them by the House of Representatives.
But then it goes to the Senate, right?
Right. And then the Senate, with the Chief Justice presiding, the Senate acts as like a court.
A trial.
Right. And then, they vote and decide. And they, in some cases, I think Andrew Johnson was censured after that, which means it's kind of like a slap on the hand. But in all of those cases, the president could have been removed from office, but was not.
Some people argue that because a president was impeached but not convicted in the Senate and thrown out of office, some people question whether or not that's given a green light to other people to push the boundaries.
Yeah, and I would say that's not the case, but again, at least in the past, it hasn't been, but we'll see. But it also, I guess, kind of what you're saying, it doesn't necessarily mean that the person didn't do what they were charged with. It's just that they didn't find it to be enough people in Congress to actually remove them from the presidency.
And just because you're impeached doesn't mean you can't run for president again and be reelected to the office if the people speak, as we saw.
Right. I would point out that incidents of probable presidential abuse of power have never been as abundant as they have been under the current president. He had 2 impeachment processes in his first administration, and we see a lot of things going on now. And again, whether you're Democrat or Republican, it shouldn't matter. You should be questioning some of these things like blowing up boats in the Caribbean or the Eastern Pacific, or taking away people who are undocumented, or arresting people who are American citizens, with
without
these
due process.
Yeah. So, you should be questioning those no matter which side of the aisle you're on. But the problem now is that so far we don't see this Congress fulfilling their duty of checks and balances on the power of this president the way they are required. We've seen the federal courts attempting to check the executive power, but the problem is the court system is naturally slow moving.
So slow.
So, and there seems to be so many things going on, that I think they just are having trouble keeping up from one day to the next. But we cannot continue to allow corruption and the excesses that we are seeing. I think I saw it was like 90% in a recent poll of people on both sides of the aisle who were highly against the tearing down of the east wing of the White House for a ballroom.
For me, it's an historical
right
and preservation issue.
Well,
I was heartbroken to see that.
When you think that the proper procedures were not taken to do that.
There was no oversight or review.
No oversight. This is the whole point that we want people to think about. Is this what you really want in a president? Also, think back, and if you're not a historian, you can look this up because I didn't want to go into extra detail here, but the progressive era, which is the early 20th century, was a response to the excesses of the Gilded Age in America, and it may take similar government reforms in the years to come to undo some of the damage being done to our government and institutions today. So it may resemble what we saw with the progressive era after the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age, by the way, was the age of the Great Gatsby, if that tells you anything.
Look what I just wrote in the column.
So, think about the big party and, the big ballroom. And we are in unprecedented times and cannot really look at our history and find a time when the executive branch has done as much in such a short time to dismantle our institutions. Ultimately, we must not lose sight that we, the people, have the power. The best thing we can do right now is keep organizing and standing up to the things we see the government doing that we don't like and or that we see as illegal. We must continue to push back against the changes that we know are wrong and not in the best interest of our nation and its people. We must take ownership and advocate for the protection of our democracy and institutions. There is strength in numbers. We must be like the patriots of colonial times fighting the British to gain independence. We must be like the people of the post-Civil War era and bring people together as one to heal our nation. We must be like the greatest generation, which came together to bring us out of the Great Depression and through World War II. We must be like the people of the Civil Rights Movement who came together for the cause of equality and effect changes. And we should look at the U.S. after 9/11 and how we came together and our patriotism was aroused after being fairly dormant for a couple of decades.
And I know you've got a couple questions to end the episode with. I saw something recently. I feel like it fits here. We should be less about what falls under the right or red column and the left or blue column, and be more about what falls in the right or wrong column. That's a path back to where we were.
I think we need to think in that way of what's the common good.
Yes.
What's the best for the most of us.
Everyone, yes.
Right.
We're never going to make everyone happy, but let's try
can't.
to do right. And
It's
when
not
you do,
realistic.
it's when you have a goal like that, you fail out of the box.
Right.
But yeah, what can we do to make the most Americans at their best?
I want to end with a couple of questions. These are, I guess, what you would call rhetoricals. First of all, when has America not been great? There are a heck of a lot more people who want to come here than who want to leave, voluntarily, I'll add. So this must be a pretty great nation to live in. And two, can we just continue the work of making it a more perfect union by moving forward instead of backward, by advancing the quest for equal rights and equal opportunities for all? Even though there isn't a period in our history exactly like the one we're living in right now, we must look back for inspiration and to remind us what we are fighting for and why we should fight for our nation. It is our responsibility to rebuild and rekindle this country, and we cannot fail. So I will end by leaving you with this question again. What good is making America great again if you end up losing the America part? So I was reading in this new book I just bought. It's called History Matters. His daughter put it together, David McCullough, who died last year, and it's a collection of some of his essays. And this essay is called Why History? And I think it goes along with what we just talked about pretty well. He says, history shows us how to behave. History teaches, reinforces what we believe in, what we stand for, and what we ought to be willing to stand up for. History is, or should be, the bedrock of patriotism, not the chest-pounding kind of patriotism, but the real thing, love of country. At their core, the lessons of history are largely lessons in appreciation. Everything we have, all our great institutions, hospitals, universities, libraries, cities, our laws, our music, art, poetry, our freedoms, everything exists because somebody went before us and did the hard work, provided the creative energy, provided the money, provided the belief. Do we disregard that? Indifference to history isn't just ignorant, it's rude. It's a form of ingratitude. I'm convinced that history encourages, as nothing else does, a sense of proportion about life, gives us a sense of the relative scale of our own brief time on Earth and how valuable that is. What history teaches, it teaches mainly by example. It inspires courage and tolerance. It encourages a sense of humor. It is an aid to navigation in perilous times. We are living now in an era of momentous change, of huge transitions in all aspects of life, nationwide and worldwide, and this creates great pressures and tensions. But history shows that times of change are the times when we are most likely to learn. This nation was founded on change. We should embrace the possibilities in these exciting times and hold to a steady course, because we have a sense of navigation, a sense of what we've been through in times past and who we are. Think how tough our predecessors were. Think what they had been through. There's no one who hasn't an ancestor who went through some form of hell. Churchill, in his great speech in the darkest hours of the Second World War, when he crossed the Atlantic, reminded us, quote, "We haven't journeyed this far because we are made of sugar candy," end quote. Now, history isn't just good for you in a civic way. It isn't just something you take to be a better citizen. It does do that, and that in itself would be reason enough to stress its importance. Jefferson said, "Any nation that expects to be ignorant and free expects what never was and never will be," end of quote. And if the gap between the educated and the uneducated in America continues to grow as it has in our time, as or faster than the gap between the rich and the poor, the gap between the educated and the uneducated is going to be of greater consequence and the more serious threat to our way of life. We must not, by any means, misunderstand that. But I think what it really comes down to is that history is an extension of life. It both enlarges and intensifies the experience of being alive. It's like poetry and art, or music, and it's ours to enjoy. If we deny our children that enjoyment, that adventure in the larger time among the greater part of the human experience, we're cheating them out of a full life. There's no secret to making history come alive. Barbara Tuchman said it perfectly, quote, "Tell stories," end quote. The pull, the appeal is irresistible because history is about two of the greatest of all mysteries, time and human nature. How lucky we are. How lucky we are to enjoy in our work and in our lives the possibilities, the precision and reach, the glories of the English language. How lucky we are, how very lucky we are to live in this great country, to be Americans, Americans all.
A good reminder. I love that. Again, those were the words of
David McCullough.
That's the author. That's who's being quoted in the essay, his daughter, you mentioned.
And this essay he gave in 1995.
Wow. And again, the name of the book?
History Matters.
History Matters. So if you'd like to look that up, it sounds like it's got some inspirational things in it.
There were lots of ones I could have read, but that was, I thought, followed up pretty well to what we were saying.
Yeah, and again, it's a reminder of the importance of things and the importance of civics and the importance of getting off the couch and the importance of going to vote, if not for yourself, for your neighbor or a family member.
And I think back right before the end of my actual script here, the part about, I know that Tony Blair, he actually had a quote, and I used to use it in my classes about, I'm going to paraphrase it, think about America, how many people want to go there, but you don't, a lot of people leaving to go live somewhere else.
Yeah, and you have to ask yourself why.
Right.
This
there has to be a reason.
A great country. It is. It has been.
And we can't keep letting it slip away.
We can't. I'm glad we did this cheerleading episode. Thank you, Bobbi, for all the hard work on that. Yep. Now it's time for the pop quiz. Bueller.
So last episode's question was, why do some states have more representatives than other states? And there were 3 possible ways to answer this, depending on how simplified you want to get. Because of the state's population, or you could have said because some states have more people than other states. Remember when we talked about how they set up our government, the House of Representatives is based on a state's population. So
certainly not based on the size or the land space.
No, it has nothing to do with...
Look at Montana and Wyoming.
Montana is a huge state land-wise, but they have 1 representative in Congress. So it's a count of the population. And
but all based on the census, which is why it's important.
But it's the same for every state.
Yep, very good. All right, so next question.
The question for this episode is, we elect a president for how many years? In other words, what is the length of their term of office?
And don't think of FDR on this one. That will lead you astray.
Just 1 term. How long do they get to serve?
Yeah. All right, so we know where we're headed for the next episode.
Right, we're going to talk about the freedom of religion part of the First Amendment.
We'll wrap up the First Amendment.
You'll have to suffer through some more court case names.
Great. All right, thank you, Bobbi. Appreciate it. That's it for this episode of Plain Civics, breaking down the basics, no politics, just facts. Thanks for listening, and until next time, stay informed and stay engaged.
This is Plain Civics. Join us for the journey as we break down the basics of how government works so you can make the government work for you.